welcome to Econversations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. The digital age has created new threats to our system of patents and copyrights, which serve to protect intellectual property. Intellectual property rights have become an important political issue, while others argue that patents and copyrights have completely outlived their usefulness and should be abandoned. Many people believe legal protection is necessary for innovation, and yet for decades the world of fashion has created enormous creativity and innovation, even though fashion designs do not enjoy copyright protection. Joining me to talk about the contributions and costs of patents and copyrights to our economy, and also what lessons we can learn about innovation from fashion design, is my guest today, Dr. Edward Lopez of the Western Carolina University, where he holds the BB&T Distinguished Professorship of Capitalism. Ed, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, Ed and I have been friends for many years. We've co-authored a paper, and just to tell our viewers a little bit about you, you're an author of over 20 articles in professional journals and of 2 books, one of which, this book here, Madmen, Intellectuals, and Academic Scribblers, I think has been extremely well received and reviewed. It talks about the public choice theory and how political ideas translate into policies and policy change.
That's right.
Ed, well, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Dan. Yeah.
Well, just to get started here, people often talk about intellectual property. I'm not sure maybe all of our viewers know exactly what we mean by this idea of intellectual property. What are some examples of intellectual property?
Well, typically you're talking about, as you mentioned with the intro to my book, co-authored with Wayne Layton, we're talking about the production of ideas in general. And with intellectual property is the notion that someone who produces an idea might be able to take ownership over that idea. And one pretty fundamental way to distinguish between this thing that we're talking about with ideas is ideas that get expressed in something tangible, in a tangible form, like words on a page, versus ideas that need to be expressed in the product themselves. And so creative expression tends to get protected by an area of law called copyright, and then these ideas for production get protected by patent. There are a couple other areas of IP law, but that's basically what we're talking about with intellectual property, is the production of ideas and the question whether the producer of that idea gets a property interest in that.
Well, if we're talking about things like new inventions or technologies, as well as like books, I'm sure like music or other creative activities, these would all seem to be things that contribute pretty significantly both to our physical and material progress in society and to our intellectual, emotional well-being as well. So it sounds like intellectual property is pretty important.
Well, I think that's right. Yeah, ideas make the world a better place, and that is ideas for goods and services to make our lives more productive, more convenient, more enjoyable. Also ideas of, in the creative world, making our lives more able to be flourishing in our lives and enjoying the arts and so forth. For all these reasons, across the board, ideas play this central role in the human condition.
Well, we've mentioned that patents and copyrights help establish some property rights over these intellectual ideas or intellectual contributions. What's sort of the economic rationale? There's an important role that these protections play in our society. So what's the economic rationale, or what's the economic role that patent and copyright protection would play in our economy?
Okay, great question. It's a big question too, and it ultimately involves a trade-off. And that trade-off is we would like to have more innovation of ideas in society for all the reasons we've already talked about, the benefits that they carry. And in order to sort of promote the innovation of new ideas, the argument is we ought to impart upon the producers of those ideas this property interest, this property right over those ideas. And so in copyright law, that means that my co-author and I have, and actually our publisher has the copyrights over the book here. And the argument is that in the presence of copyright law, we'll have more books like this, more books that enrich the human condition than we would otherwise. And that's the sort of one side of the trade-off here, is that giving authors and inventors the exclusive rights to their produced ideas, that promotes innovation, and that's the good side of the trade-off.
And to some extent, that can be necessary because ideas are so easy to sort of like copy or share with others. I mean, if I get an important idea from you, I can just turn around and share it with somebody else as well.
Yeah,
and,
that's right.
Certainly in science, there are problems of somebody trying to claim credit for coming up with that idea, but simply the economic value of you come up with some brilliant, some brilliant invention like Thomas Edison, for instance. I get the idea from you, and then I can turn around and sell it. Right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, ideas are different. Unlike an acre of corn, or unlike a run of automobiles off the assembly line, once those things are produced, and if those things get consumed by somebody, no one else can consume that same acre of corn. No one else can drive that same car that comes off the line. But with ideas, for example, books, somebody could, for example, photocopy the pages. Somebody could, for example, digitize them and make them available on the internet. And what that means, Dan, is that you can read the book, and the next person can read the book, and the next person all the way down the line without interfering with each other's abilities to read the book. Very much unlike the acre of corn. And so, recognizing that attribute of ideas, that people can consume them without interfering with other people's abilities to also consume them. That's also behind this economic rationale for copyrights and patents. We need that exclusive right in order to promote the innovation of ideas. We need the ability for the copyright holder to prevent the photocopiers, to prevent the digitizers from going around and spreading copies of the promoted idea, because why would you have any motivation to write the great American novel, for example, if you know that as soon as you're done, interlopers can come in and take your novel, make photocopies of it, and start selling it right underneath your nose? Under that reasoning, the argument is we would have far less innovation of ideas absent the copyright law.
And there's also, just since these are property rights, there is sort of like a ethical element of ownership. I mean, if you or I were to build like a chair or something, we could keep possession of that, but we would want to keep possession of it until we decided to sell it or something like that, because it's ours, we built it, it's my product, and you can't take it from me unless I decide to give it or trade it to you. Sure. And there's some element, same element of this with your book or our other intellectual products as well, right?
Sure. I want to make a distinction there with your example, though. I mean, certainly if you bring home some lumber and you make a chair out of it, both the ethics and the economics of that scenario make sense for you to be able to establish rightful ownership over that chair. But do you have the rightful ownership over the idea of a chair? Can I go home and, with some lumber on my part, and create a chair of my own, or does that interfere with your with the process that you went through in making your chair? I think that's an important distinction to keep track of. Yeah. It's going to come up when we get to talking about fashion and when we get to talking about some other industries. And it also brings up the other side of this trade-off that's involved with the economics of providing intellectual property law. And so think about this phrase that I've been using, exclusive right. If you produce the great American novel, you then, under copyright law, have the exclusive right to bring that to market. Exclusive right you can think of as synonymous with a single seller or a monopoly. And the sort of other edge of this intellectual property argument from an economics point of view is you're going to have limited access to the great American novel under copyright compared to the absence of copyright. So the trade-off is we have copyright law there in order to promote people writing the great American novel, but the fact that the copyright is there means that access to the great American novel, once it's written, is going to be limited. And so that's the big trade-off there, is you have this incentive on the one side to innovate, and you have this access problem on the other once the innovation is created. And so where it comes down is, like a lot of economic arguments, it's this balancing of the trade-off, and where we see innovators really responding to the exclusive right, and where we see that exclusive right interfering relatively little with access, that's where you have the strongest argument in place for IP law. On the other hand, where you have innovators not very responsive at all to the exclusive right, maybe they're maintaining their creativity for other reasons besides the copyright law. Maybe somebody just has the great American novel, in their belly, and they can't prevent themselves. They can't help but clicking the keys out and getting it down on paper. Or maybe they have other ways of making money.
Right.
If the innovation itself is not very responsive to the presence of copyright law, then all you're really doing is limiting access with the copyright law. And in those scenarios, the economic argument for IP protection begins to break down.
So we do have this trade-off, and I think intellectual property is one area where I think a lot of free market economists even disagree with each other.
Sure.
It's just they come down on different sides of this
Sure.
trade-off, and it's certainly a trade-off that has been around for a long time. In fact, copyright and patent protection was authorized in the U.S. Constitution. So back in 1787, when our founding fathers were getting together to draft the Constitution, they thought it was important enough to put into the Constitution there. So these are not new issues that we're grappling with here today. Right?
That's right. I think the phrasing in Article 1, Section 8 is to promote the sciences and useful arts. And originally, the types of things that were covered were maps, maps of ocean shores and so forth that were useful. And then it expanded to other areas over the years and decades. The Copyright Act did.
In recent years, there seems to have been a new phenomenon that's arisen, and that's possibly socially unproductive litigation over patent infringement or copyright infringement that some commentators think are actually slowing innovation.
Sure.
And so these might be thought of as some of the additional side effects, because we've always had this trade-off between trying to encourage innovation versus giving somebody a monopoly control or limiting access to the innovation. But we've gotten this new wave of litigation over patents and copyrights, and the phrase a patent troll has emerged, and it certainly suggests some further activity that's not helping our economy. Can you describe a little bit what's going on with this litigation?
Well, I think so, and it comes back to this economic argument, wanting to provide the incentive to innovate. Well, when you bring in an exclusive right, in order to provide that incentive to innovate, you're also actually introducing additional incentives along the way. And one is the incentive to appropriate an idea that's already been produced, whether by yourself or by someone else. And so, for example, the Copyright Act has been extended most recently in 1998, before that in 1976, to cover works that had already been established, that had already been written or created. And so think about that for a second. You have goods that are already created, and you're extending the copyright protection, the duration of copyright protection over them. By definition, you're not doing anything to promote the innovation of those already created goods, but arguably you're promoting the incentive to continue investing in those goods. But to answer your question, you're also introducing this incentive to profit further from being able to appropriate the innovation that has already been existing. And so here, that gets to your question about patent trolls as well. And so one way to run, say, a high-tech business is to say, I'm going to innovate a new process, or I'm going to innovate a new app or a new product, and seek a patent over that and then bring that to market. Another way, which has become more common, is to say, I'm going to buy up we're going to expand and merge with this other firm because this other firm has an impressive patent portfolio. And none of those patents really is valuable right now, but they might become valuable after the next round of innovation in consumer goods, electronics, or what have you. Somewhere down the line, it might become valuable. And so you're purchasing the company for the purpose of maybe those patents becoming valuable in the future. And how do they become valuable? Well, another company, another startup, another app developer, what have you, is using the processes, using the ideas that are covered by those patents, and you say, aha, you're using my property now. It's my property because I merged with this other firm some time back, and I did so for the purpose of maybe their patent would one day become valuable. Here we are at that day, and therein comes your patent infringement suit. So this is another type of incentive. It's not an incentive to innovate or create in the patent world. It's an incentive to hoard patents for the purpose of punishing others when they come up with an innovation that's covered by those patents.
Right. And so I guess one way to think of it is that you have a book about public choice, and you're former president of the Public Choice Society. One of the problems is that we're never going to have, from an economist standpoint, a perfect patent law. We're going to have a patent law that's going to, copyright laws that are going to be affected by some political considerations, and they're going to add some extra costs onto this.
Right.
So, but our whole patent debate and copyright debate is sort of premised on this idea that without patent or copyright protection, we would have a low supply of these intellectual products, and given how important they are for our progress and prosperity, it's something we want to try to encourage. But we have the interesting case of fashion, right? And fashion seems to be an exception to this.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about how fashion operates, because they don't have this copyright protection.
Yeah, and I think that the most sort of significant point that you're making to me is that this argument that we need intellectual property law protection in order to promote innovation, it's not a universal argument. It's a contextual one. It's almost like a case-by-case one. What type of innovation are you talking about? What industry of that type of innovation are you looking at? And so when it comes to certain areas, you mentioned fashion. I've paid attention to the fashion industry for some time. Here's an area where fashion designers do not enjoy copyright protection. They don't enjoy patent protection. Fashion labels have a little bit of trademark protection. But for the most part, intellectual property law has let this market run wild. And what we've seen is, contrary to the standard economic argument, is an industry that lacks IP protection but is demonstrably innovative. Every year comes along new and novel twists on the designs of tops and bottoms and shoes and hats and gloves and all the other things. Every year you have new designers seeking to sort of punctuate that stratosphere of elite designers, and sometimes you see some people, young designers, moving up really quickly, and it's because of their relative innovations. We have a sort of steady stream, a demonstrable steady stream of innovation in the fashion world, despite not having any IP protection. So at the very least, it's an anomaly compared to the standard economic argument. But it's more than that. It poses the question of how do we account for that, and what do we learn when we start to scrutinize this industry some more?
Just to be clear, you did mention that they have some trademark protection, because I'm sure all of our viewers have seen some designer labels or logos on clothes. So if you could just explain a little bit more about what is protected there, about say Ralph Lauren's polo design, and what isn't protected.
Well, I mentioned a little while ago that if you make the chair, the physical product that you make is yours, and it should be yours. But you don't have the rights to the idea of a chair.
Right.
And so that partly is involved with what's going on with trademark protection in the fashion world. So Ralph Lauren would have rights over the polo figure that is embroidered into that label's polo shirts. But they don't have, they're not protected on the idea of a polo shirt. The configuration of that particular type of shirt, the silhouette that it makes when it's cut, and so forth. And the reason for making the logo property and not the idea of the garment is on the one hand, you want consumers to be able to identify brands.
Right.
And brand identification is important to things like what type of quality is the garment, what sort of style segment is the garment in, and what type of signals it sends. All of these things are valuable to consumers. It makes sense for the law to say this is a polo shirt, and other shirts cannot come and make themselves look like a polo shirt by stealing Ralph Lauren's polo embroidery, right? Same with handbag designs, and that's why most people would know about the fact that there's a huge market for imitations, for knockoffs, if you will. You have your luxury brand handbags that are sold in upscale malls and airports across the world, and then you have your imitations of that, your counterfeits of that. And those are violations of trademark law because these goods are presenting themselves as authentics, as the originals, but they're doing so in a fabricated and a false way. So that's the idea behind trademark law, is to make sure that consumers aren't confused between the genuines and between genuine brands and their competing genuine brands, but also between genuine brands and the counterfeit knockoffs.
So when fashion designers are claiming that they want greater protection, what stage in sort of like the production of clothing are they worried about? Are they concerned about, ownership of these prototype designer clothes that are being worn on runways at Fashion Week every year, or is there something beyond that they're concerned about?
Well, a subset of the industry, the fashion industry, has proposed a copyright bill. They proposed that the Copyright Act be extended to fashion designs. And what they proposed is that the appearance as a whole of a garment or of an ensemble be protected. And so the appearance as a whole would cover things like the particular cut, silhouette, color palette, fit, and so forth. And so that if you were to see an original being modeled, and you would see a fake of that original being modeled, and most people's reactions would be those look very much the same, this proposal to the Copyright Act would be, let's cover those cases, where most people would sort of take the two looks to be the same. What this subset of the industry is not saying is, they're not saying we need this copyright extension in order to promote innovation in fashion design. What they're saying is that we need this in order to promote fairness. Because too many of our designers are coming up with new ideas. They're producing beautiful garments at great cost to themselves and their investors. And as soon as those new designs come down the runway during Fashion Week, digital images of them are being zoomed around the world, and production of certain of those is starting off more or less immediately. And you have this familiar tale going on of where it's not the writer of the novel now, but it's the designer of the dress now that cannot sort of appropriate or cannot sort of gain financially by their own innovation, by their own hard work. And so the industry is arguing on a basis of fairness, not the sort of typical economic argument of promoting innovation.
Okay. Yeah. So we talked about how it is that these fashion designers people are trying to get into the business. They are coming up with designs. They are being creative and innovative, and yet they can't patent or they can't get copyright protection on the design itself. What is motivating them if they're not getting a lot of money out of it?
Yeah, so you might ask, what are they responding to if not copyright protection? Well, I think that there's a couple of good answers there. One is that they have ways of gaining in a monetary sense, in a monetary way. If they become well known as a designer, well known enough to where they can license their designer name to wares and products that have high markups. So for example, perfumes and sunglasses and scarves and things like that. Another type of answer to the question is that fashion designers, like a lot of creators in different areas, they're not necessarily in it for the money. They're not necessarily in it to have this exclusive right to be the seller of their wares. Some of them actually recognize that copying is going to happen. Some of them actually not only just recognize it, but they say this is good for me because it makes my designs have more exposure than they would otherwise. And so you see high-end designers in the fashion world responding to other things besides the copyright protection. They're responding to the desire to be more known in a sort of broad sense, get more exposure for their designs. Right. They're hoping to get a good enough name recognition behind their design company, their name, so that they can license their name to other types of products. And then maybe most, sort of intrinsically, fashion designers are oftentimes motivated to have the esteem of other fashion designers. And this is true not just in fashion, but in all, like in our line of work, economics. You want to have the recognition of your peers. And so you're talking about fairly small circles of people here. Right. And when you're talking about fairly small circles of experts, the very nuances of what you're doing and what advances you're making, if those can be appreciated by your peers, oftentimes that is the channel that people are tapping into with their
innovations. So I mean, I think this is some of the A-listers sitting along the runway, and I guess what you're suggesting is to be highly regarded by these folks is what the designer, the fashion designers are ultimately maybe going after.
They don't care about Congress. They care about who's sitting in the front row at their fashion show. And
to be taken seriously, or for them to recognize that, oh, that's a great design, or that's really innovative, that's really trendsetting. And I guess we see this in other cases. I mean, we do have this open source computer code that code writers around the world will voluntarily supply the code into some of these programming systems, and video game designers will add stuff onto video games that aren't there. And again, I think they're going for a lot of this recognition or fame or renown or something like that, right?
I think so, and I think that these sorts of intrinsic motivations, they account for all kinds of ideas being produced. Just look at Wikipedia, for example. The entire thing is produced for this type of thing you're talking about. And in that sense, the intrinsic motivations for creativity and for the production of ideas, those are things that this exclusive right have a hard time tapping into, the exclusive right that patents and copyrights. And so what I would suggest is that at least, when we're looking at this area of law, copyright and patent, understand that there are other motivations for creativity besides having the exclusive right. And maybe push it one step further and say maybe these areas of law need some looking at and should be reformed. And so maybe we don't need 70 years or 90 years of copyright protection over written works in order to promote the innovation of written works. Maybe we have just a little bit too much copyright protection on the books. And maybe the patent trolls are a way to say we have too much patent protection on the books as well.
Well, it was a fascinating discussion. I think, how widely do you think that the lessons from fashion might have applications in other areas?
Well, I'm working on that right now, and I'm working on implications for areas that you might think of that need copyright protection, like music and film, as well as some others that you might not know about, like magic and stand-up comedy, things that have been written on before, but I'm going to try to add my own twist to them myself.
Oh, yeah, very, very interesting, and I just love these intrinsic motivations and how they, I think, often overlap with our profit motives as well. So,
absolutely.
Well, thanks very much for coming on the show, Ed.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Join us again next time for another Econversations.